Hello, 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 hello. It is your good friend Wild Philosopher here to remind you once more that gnomes are real. I've brought my friend out of heaven with me today, and tonight we will be having a talk about ideology and why ideology is in fact disastrous if you want to actually, be a philosopher or think a little. Because of the way ideology cripples our ability to use language. Uh, we'll be talking we'll be talking about a few things such as repetitiveness in ideological discourse and how language structures reality. Uh, we don't have as much in the way of media in mind today. I know generally we like to do our streams based around something. I will be talking about why I hate Orwell's 1984. Uh, we'll be talking about why Fahrenheit 451 has proved remarkably prescient. And then I guess we'll be talking a little bit about anime popes again. Uh,
As
I've
one does.
as one does. I've brought it up before. If any of you have not listened to that stream, it's currently privated because I wasn't too sure about it, but I'll probably open it up again after tonight's stream, and then just do a revised version later. Because I think, in retrospect, I think I misdiagnosed the issue, but not by much. I just think it was slightly more. Maybe it was about as rebarbative as it needed to be. Just it could have been linguistically less rebarbative, shall we say?
What does rebarbative mean? I say this both for the viewers and for myself because you lost me.
To push people away. I mean, to barb, right?
Okay.
Is to barb as in like to ward away. It combines being prickly with being vituperative, or like spiteful. Because
this is not another yonderism like sequence.
No, rebarbative is an old. You see it paired with vituperative. It's like he had a rebarbative and vituperative personality. Like Harlan Ellison, the sci-fi writer, was famous for his rebarbative personality. It's just a fancy way of saying he was a dick. It means he was both. It both means that somebody is prickly. But if you say somebody is prickly, that it means they are a little difficult to get along with, but doesn't necessarily mean anything bad about them as a person. As opposed to like it maybe just means they're really shy and they're yandere or tsundere. Sorry, they manifest their shyness through being a bit of a bit prickly. Such as what was his name, Mr. Palmer in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility is intended to be the characteristic prickly person who's not actually all that mean. In his case, he's just prickly to be because he thinks that being offensive makes him look smarter. Which Austen was spot on with that one. Austen, we always talk about how people are like performatively self-righteous or virtuous. We never talk about all the people who are performative dicks, and they're actually just way nicer than you think they are, and they're just being being way meaner than they could be for some really weird reason, like they think it's socially expected of them.
All right. So
but rebarbative is much stronger. He's prickly and he's actually a dick.
Anyway, sorry. So what you were saying is you were trying to make sure you weren't too much of a dick about anime popes.
Yeah, I stand by everything in the anime pope stream. I realized midway through that it's often ignorance rather than malice, and Junji's term boorishness is probably less offensive.
All right.
Shall we say? I addressed it as bigotry, and I think that carries too many strong connotations in the West. Whereas in the original word, like we spoke about, prejudicium or prejudice is from a Latin legal term, which means to pass judgments with little knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's where words like prejudice and bigotry enter the English language. English, not as terms for like. Nowadays we use them in an identity sense. When you say he's a bigot, you usually mean that to some group of people, such as women or Jews. Whereas historically, it simply meant that he held harsh but ultimately rather flimsy views on it. And you could use it in reference to anything. Like he had very bigoted views on pineapple pizza. He had knee-jerk hated anyone who enjoyed pineapple. Or even worse, people who don't like mushrooms. Cough, cough.
All right.
But without Hound embodying that Christian virtue there. Forbearing on behalf of, as Jesus Christ forbeared.
Yes, I forbear for the sake of pineapple pizza.
Yes,
but yeah. So, what do we mean by ideology? I think that's like big, right? Because we're throwing around this fancy word here, and
yes. No. Yeah, I've done a little video on this. Have you watched the little video? I'll restate the argument, but just for my own edification.
I might have a long time ago, but not recently enough to know what you're saying. Like,
so I think
you were down on the term ideology, whereas I think there's a thing there, but we need to redefine how we define it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, my issue with ideology is I think people of several distinct pejoratives, ideology, fundamentalism, and they use these words as pejoratives when really these are they should be used as technical terms for a very broad phenomenon that occurs to everyone. I am certainly no exception here. This is not the I'm amazing because I'm not ideological stream, where we adopt philosophical views or definitions or ways of seeing the world that preclude a consideration, not of why they might be wrong, but why of other people might think they're wrong. Which is an important distinction because I think one of the reasons people fall into the pit of ideology or fundamentalism is they think they can't, they think they cannot accept that there could be any alternative. Because accepting that implies some sort of slide into, relativism, or seeing the thing as false or whatever. Not that I don't hate relativism, but they lose the ability to engage in the as if.
All right.
And this...
yeah, I feel like I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't make like a dumpster joke here in honor of Zizek.
What was the Zizek? I actually...
You never seen the clip where it's like, I eat out of the trash can all the time, but the trash can I eat out of is ideology.
Yeah. But as I said, I think my beef with the word,
all right,
and my beef with fundamentalism, because I think the two are just the same thing. It's just typically we use ideology in politics and we use fundamentalism in religion. And my beef with it is it's basically it's when you adopt internal postulates that prevent you from seeing why others might sincerely disagree. And so, there's all kinds of different ways to reach this. We'll actually be talking about a couple. The really historically, one of the easiest ways to slide into it has been the demon pitfall, which I think we talked about on the Pope stream, which is, I don't think I need to go too much into that one. I think people know.
Yeah.
I have a pretty good idea what if you've spoken to any evangelical. The more recent ideologies have focused very heavily on interpretation. So here's an interesting fact, I guess, about perception is all actions of perception are simultaneously interwoven with interpretation.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. You say yes, that actually is very controversial not in philosophical quarters. This is very obvious knowledge that nobody's going to blink at. Let's just be clear.
So
that
who is so unstudied as not to believe that every observation is filtered through a net of interpretation?
Mostly, this is what's going to be like I hate the word, like public or pop intellectuals / talking heads. You get a weird divide in the public sphere that you don't get in academia. As much as I may detest academia, they absolutely are in the win on this one. Between people who totally reject the notion that their observations are interpreted. They just think the world is as it is, and it's just common sense or.
I hate the term common sense.
Yeah, I hate it too, but yeah, common sense, the obvious, and otherwise you're going to. And we'll be taught. I'm speeding through this now, but we'll be returning again and again to this trait because I see it everywhere. And then the alternative is to lean very heavily on interpretation, but refuse to accept that there's any other interpretation of the observations, either because you're a hardline relativist who just thinks that it doesn't matter what your interpretation is, or because you're some deranged absolutist who thinks that your interpretation is the only correct one. And the issue with this, again, is it's not the question of whether or not you are correct. Let's just be, I'm not certain I'm correct about everything, but there are some things in certain I'm correct on. The problem arises when you lose the ability to see why someone might disagree. And that tends to be where as I said, this... An ideology or fundamentalism, it's not actually any specific position. And people are always... My issue with it is people are always trying to apply it to specific positions. That's not the case. You can be a capitalist or a communist or a creationist or an atheist and not be an ideologue / fundamentalist. Or you could be any of these things and be an ideologue and be a fundamentalist.
Okay, so I still think we're kind of working around what an ideology is. Yeah. And I'm not sure whether we're kind of having exactly the same take, even though I think we're generally going to agree. I would say that ideology is that net through which you filter things. That would be my definition of ideology. What are you defining it as here?
I would have to disagree because that would just redefine ideology as just a theory.
A theory in what sense?
That's what you just described is what a theory. Like a theory in Young Chul Han's phrase is something that differentiates. It tells you what does and does not count as evidence. Right.
I'm thinking of this on the kind of the instinctual level, right? Like my mind just automatically says what it thinks is stupid. Like it's not like maybe it's a theory if you kind of transpose theory as like an instinctual thing rather than like a conscious.
No, I just mean everybody has to have a net for filtering.
Yeah.
Even that's not a even if you're a saint, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'll give an example here. When Ryan and I do streams on fairy lore, we explicitly filter out old data derived from people with severe schizophrenia.
Yeah.
That's not because I don't like, or it's not because I don't like those people, or because I think they're always wrong or lying, or because I don't think they should be listened to. I do think you should listen. Like, if you ever meet if you're walking in a big city and you meet a schizophrenic, you always listen to what they have to say. It's one of the few
Yeah.
things you can do to them. But I just don't think it's useful data on the supernatural because they're severely schizophrenic.
I think you're making that as like a logical kind of value judgment, as opposed to kind of like one level down. What do you call the instinctual version of that to differentiate it from, like, when you're like, maybe we shouldn't listen to schizophrenics.
Oh yeah. Maybe schizospirituality is not all that certain message boards have cracked it up to be. Yeah, I guess that would just be boorishness. That's just like there's the implicit character flaw of not being able to listen to people, or listen to others, right? Because you can again listen to people, conclude they're incorrect. These things, it's like you have to, if you respect people, you agree with them. It's like no, you can listen to people and conclude they're full of shit. Whereas for me, an ideology differs from, not to say the instinctual stuff is bad, because it is bad. In fact, I think it's the badness that leads to what an ideology is, just an intellectual formulation of a character flaw.
All right. Like, it sounds like how you're defining it is like if you have that net, but it's just like so rigid that it can't be adjusted.
Yeah, and it can't acknowledge the existence of other nets. Again, it's not even a question of like, are other nets correct? It's just a question of why are other nets making the judgments they are, assuming they're not like insane or evil, which is another form of ideology.
So yeah, I think you and I were talking at like a different time, and you were talking about like the issue of the gaze. So it's like you have like the internal gaze and the external gaze, and if you have neither of those, you're kind of scuffed.
Yeah, I guess that would be fair. Yeah, for the purposes of this lecture, I am defining ideology as this intellectual formulation of what is a mostly instinctual character flaw, which is the tendency to reject what we see or what others tell us on the basis of flimsy or no evidence, which in an ideology formalizes itself into dogma for one reason or another.
Yeah.
So there's different ways of doing. You can reject the observation. So like, such as I used the example earlier of demons. One of the well-known alternatives is just everyone involved is hallucinating. Is that before St. Augustine, or is actually, yes, that's Clement of Alexandria. Asserts that prophecy amongst pagans is entirely the result of dementia. Yeah, very respectful. That is an ideological maneuver, because he acknowledges that phenomenal or observationally, prophesying is identical whether you're Christian or pagan or Jewish. But he wants to make a divide, so he just divides the like he denies that the observations made by pagans are real because it's actually the result of a mental illness. In contradistinction to the preaching of the church, which is true and trustworthy. That would be an example of denying on the basis of observation. And then you can also go and you can deny on interpretation.
All right.
Which would be, for instance, if you say, well, none of these people actually saw these things because all pagans are in a conspiracy to mislead people from the one God.
All right.
Which is the sort of religious version of critical theory, which just makes the same decision, but in the political sphere.
All right.
So that, yeah, that's ideology of, I guess, interpretation. And then, of course, there's other types, like only my, you don't really see ideology of conclusion, which is only my conclusion is correct.
Yep.
But mostly because that one is too obviously absurd. You sometimes see that in the public sphere, but very, very rarely, if never, by like an actual philosopher, theologian, political theorist, etc. It's just too obviously ridiculous. So yeah, is that an acceptable working definition?
Yeah, I think so.
Thus far, beautiful, beautiful. So the title of this stream then is Ideology: The End of Communication. And I guess the question arises, why do I, a wild philosopher, your friendly talking badger image, because my computer broke and I can't run the goblin dude, why do I think ideology impacts communication? Right, so communication is, let's just state some blunt, very obvious, non-profound facts for a moment. Communication is the passage of information between two people, at a minimum. It can potentially involve more people, but at least two people. Unless you think books of souls, in which case reading is also communication. But we'll put interesting side views to the side for the moment. Communication between two people. That communication is encoded by the first person, and then it's decoded by the other, which is just a fancy way of saying that I do not beam my meaning direct into the mind of my interlocutor. I phrase it with language.
Yeah.
Or symbol.
You can encode something well and badly, right? On purpose sometimes even.
Oh, yeah. Plenty of people involved. I mean, sometimes there's bad communication. Like poetry. Poetry derives its power from its exceptional vagueness. When it comes to metaphor stuff like that, if it didn't do anything like that, it would just suck. It would be very boring. So good poetry is good bad communication. On the flip side, you can also employ that communication to be exceptionally ridiculous, I guess.
Yeah.
Either by employing willfully misleading language, like loud popping noises heard at political rally, or by a corporate newspeak. I wrote a novel last year, which I'm trying to edit to release in time for Christmas this year, called The Eldritch Horror Who Saved Christmas. And he engaged in battle with evil wizards, demonic wizards, who use corporate newspeak to poison corpo speak, what we call like synergistic energy solutions, to poison the minds of their interlocutors. That's all intentional. They write that way to confuse the audience and to elicit an emotional response without any developing real understanding.
Yeah.
And they use it internally too, not just for shareholders, but for employees.
Yeah.
Because it makes it easier to.
What was the there's like the right to work bill?
I am not familiar with American legislation.
Oh, you're not familiar with the right to work bill.
I am familiar with America's notorious tendency of passing like bills that have one name and then the contents of the bill are something totally different and run for like what was the one, the COVID relief bill that like gave $1 billion to Sudan and banned China from determining who the Dalai Lama could reincarnate as?
Yeah.
And it's called like COVID relief, and I'm like, the what now? What does the Sudanese army and the Dalai Lama have to do with it? No disrespect to His Holiness. Yeah, and I know that. I do know that. I don't know the right to. Is it a bill that like obligates you to work or?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's they. Yeah.
Yeah. And they do that because they know that nobody reads past the headline.
Exactly.
Same with journalists. A lot of really awful articles, the reporting is actually fine. It's just the headline. The headline that's friggin' because they know that people just look at the article headline and move on most of the time. Not for any irrational reason. It's like if I'm going to spend 10 minutes reading the newspaper, I'm just not going to read every article I come across. I'm going to read the one I want to. Sorry. Which means their goal is A, to get me to read it, but B, to direct my opinions by putting nonsense titles like popping noises at rally or one person dead when they know it was actually like one American dead when it was actually 10 people but only one was American, and so they don't report on the other 9. So on, and like there are 1,000,001 formulations, and we could spend hours talking about like how absolutely monumentally duplicitous newspapers are. But yeah, like there's you can encode information so people cannot understand it. One of the other things that people forget, though, or maybe aren't aware of, is language. How you phrase things determines the value you assign to them and the way you understand them. So to put it another way, I think most people are aware of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Yeah, Sapir-Whorf.
Sapir-Whorf. Oh yeah, sorry, Edward Sapir. Which is simply that language either determines or influences thought. That might be true, that might be false. What is very undeniable, on the other hand, is that the way you phrase language and what you can put into language, because if you can't phrase something because the language doesn't have it, it doesn't matter if you know it or not. You just can't communicate it. But the way you phrase things directly determines how you perceive them. Right. So connotative language, just what you choose to describe. I've used it as an example on this channel before, but because I know a lot of people watch one video but not another, let me give you a sentence here. You're standing around, and I come up to you, and I'm like, "Hey, Hound, did you know all of Western civilization was invented by a conspiracy of Freemasons who spread magic mushroom consumption because they wanted everyone to worship Mithras?" Okay, who am I? A weird hobo living under a bridge, or a Ivy League graduate with tenure at Brown or Boston University, like Ivy League school with endorsements from every major news site and most of America's foremost public intellectuals?
I'm going to guess the latter.
Yeah, Carl A.P. Ruck. And what it was he didn't say that. He said, I wrote a book on the transformative impact of the ergo mushroom on Western civil history.
Yeah.
Which is the exact same. Yeah. It before on this stream. I'm happy to use it. I'll probably bring it up again because it was just such a perfect example. Both thematically, or because it hit all the features, but also because it's not controversial. You've no idea how many people in where I live absolutely lose their crap if you say self-improvement. because they think that you're like a follower of Jordan Peterson. But if you say self-cultivation, it's like I'm deeply interested in cultivating myself. All of a sudden, you're totally fine, totally acceptable. Oh, I'm off studying. I'm studying German Bildung. Bildung, yeah. That one thing is admittedly in a different language, but yeah, like cultivation and self-improvement are synonyms.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's some subtle differences in the connotations and the sense of the word, but it's the same word. Same with those were the two. Those were the same sentence. Fun. I mean, one like if you don't know that ergo is the mushroom they make LSD out of, you maybe would not have gotten the full import of that sentence. But it's basically the same sentence. The
All
only
right.
difference is one is an obvious load of rot because the Eucharist is very clearly not a shroom, and the other sounds academically respectable.
Yeah. So they encode the language in such a way that it sounds reasonable, even if the contents of what they're actually meaning is completely bonkers.
Yeah. You
All
also
right.
have the reverse, but that tends to be from ignorance rather than on print, which is when people have a totally sensible solution to a problem, but they have no idea how to express themselves. So they use some language that makes them sound like totally bonkers, and everyone's like, "Oh, he's mad," uh, and so they like arrest him. And then 20 years later, they realize he was correct and he just couldn't communicate. Because he was, I don't know, he was a scientist who and spent 50 hours a week in his lab and hadn't spoken to another human being in 5 years when he made his pronouncement on hand washing or whatever. That a real example. That one. Actually, I don't know if it was that one wasn't quite communication. There were a whole bunch of other issues going on, but yeah, he was arrested. He was imprisoned. Uh, but yeah, that one is not intentional. Nobody. There are some actually. J.G. Haman was famous for doing that on purpose, but in general, people don't do stuff like that on purpose. Weird German romantic philosophers being the notable exception. I do recommend if anyone here enjoys reading philosophy as a literary composition, you will just love Haman because it's absolutely nothing but inscrutable references to ancient Greek plays and like talking letters of the alphabet. And a lot of what he's trying to communicate is just totally normal. It's just totally normal. He just encoded it really weirdly on purpose because he wanted nobody who wasn't intelligent to understand him. Which is based, I guess. But yeah, you can encode it, and then the other person has to decode it. So the problem there, of course, one is, I mean, if you encoded it insincerely or dishonestly, they're not going to decode it properly. Two, if they have some differing understanding of the words than you do. Sometimes this isn't like in context. This is mostly going to be intentional, right? Like when people willfully equivocate between multiple different words or different meanings which have the same word.
I mean, we mess around with this all the time, right? Like I think there's like a famous sketch from Abbott and Costello about who's on first.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. It's something most people they're implicitly aware of. A lot don't know they know it. It's not. It's intuitive knowledge is the philosophical technical term.
Yeah.
It's intuitive knowledge. Some people know about it, and which is why you'll see some people switch between like biological racism or systemic racism in a letter because they want people to equate the two in their mind when the two are distinct. But yeah, people play around with that all the time. There's nothing wrong with it, like on its own, because that's what makes a lot of comedy so funny, a lot of poetry so lovely. Like people will switch, or like they'll switch between tresses of hair and like tresses of flowers in poems, stuff like that. Like nothing wrong with that. in that case, the effect on the audience is intended, and it's not like the audience gets upset because the audience, you're in a game. I'm not quite a Wittgensteinian, but Wittgenstein is this concept of language games, which are played according to shared rules. I'm not quite a Wittgensteinian, but I do think it helps explain why people don't mind when poets or comedians manipulate language, but they do mind when the newspaper manipulates language.
Yeah, when
Because
the news folks or the politicians manipulate language, they're doing it to willfully cut down what you can do or understand, right?
yeah, or even just to willfully not talk to you. Which is, we want to talk about one of the ways ideology occludes languages is people will try and get you to play into their language game, and you'll be pointing out, and they're full of crap, right? But and they know they're full of crap, but they don't want to have an honest conversation with you because their goal is to, I don't know, control you or manipulate you or make you powerless. So they lie to your face and play around with the terms. See my earlier example about like different ways in which people use racism.
All right.
And it's duplicitous. Even if you believe in this sort of thing, it's duplicitous because instead of having an honest conversation with the other person, you're just lying to their face to insult them, and then lying to your audience. But yeah, and then of course there's other reasons, like if people have the wrong cultural knowledge, when you get a lot of decoding issues with ESL speakers. English is a second language. Sorry for those just who don't know what that means. And oftentimes it can lead to some really weird. I have a printing device, and as a slogan, in it you can tell they used like Google Translate to translate out of Chinese because it says I was like, print many things, have little happiness. Of course, it's merely meant to communicate that it'll bring a small joy into your life. But that's not what the sentence means. Yeah. I love this. I want to say it's a pair.
All right. So so by now, I think we've established that you can encode things well, or you can encode things badly. Sometimes that can be on purpose. Sometimes that's utterly accidental because you're not educated, or this is not your first language, or you're just not paying attention that day.
Or you just don't have the knowledge. You're using a term you don't fully understand. This verges, as I said, into ideology when it's done intentionally, for one of two reasons. The first being to, as I said, bring the other person into their language game.
So we've established ideology is like that net, but it's just like stultified. How do you do something intentionally if you've kind of stuck yourself into this eternal unintentional mode?
Yeah, so that would be where you're playing with the interpretation. So I mentioned earlier that you can accept that there's either one or multiple interpretations, but you are so blinded that you simply refuse to acknowledge that there's sincerity behind the other interpretation. Such as, for instance, I think the earliest example I know of is going to be the routine argument in some early Christian writers that certain pagan symbols point to Jesus. or contrary-wise, symbols that are remarkably similar to Jesus were planted. This is in Justin Martyr. Certain symbols that look identical to Jesus, like the Mithraic bread and wine, were planted by Satan to discredit the church.
All right.
This is playing around with the interpretation, and so if you're in practical terms, of course, if I'm using this to talk to someone, like let's say I'm talking to Mithraist. There haven't been any for 1600 years, but let's just pretend that there's like moments before Theodosius the Great passed his edict banning paganism and destroyed all the Mithraic temples. Gaius, the Roman Mithraist, got in his teleportation device and he came to 2024, and he's joined this discussion. And Gaius is sitting here, and I know the meaning Gaius imputes to his words, but by shifting it to prefiguring Jesus, I am erasing like Gaius's actual beliefs.
All right.
And I'm erasing what Gaius is trying to say, and I'm just trying to shift the conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be clear, there's a very different way where you can talk about Jesus prefiguring things which does not fall into that trap. So, but that's a different topic. In our time, you mostly see this with people who have accepted views that see certain worldviews or ways of using language as being either completely insincere or resulting purely from like evil.
Mm-hmm.
This is the original meaning of critical theory. It has nothing to do with a specific political venture, as it's often misunderstood in the media. It has to do with a way of analyzing claims.
All right.
The critical theory aims to expose, in its own words, it aims to expose the violence that underlies ideology or tradition. Bearing in mind that ideology here usually just means people who don't believe what I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So
this is a different reading of what ideology means.
Yes, this is I'm using their original words to be as close to them as possible, but let's just be clear that these are two totally different. One on like I was very clear to clarify that I think I won't say you can hold any position and not be an ideologue, but I think most positions can be held without committing yourself to ideology.
All right.
There are a handful of exceptions where it's just so baked in, usually intentionally, that I think it's inescapable. But generally, I think you can hold just about any philosophy you want and be an honest, sincere, scholarly individual. You could be wrong, like very, very wrong, but not an ideologue. In the case of they're using it. So there's two different streams of critical theory. There's the liberal stream associated with the early Jürgen Habermas, and that's the stream that really made it to America because it got picked up by people like Rorty and spread throughout the American literati. The other one is the Marxist stream. From Theodor Adorno, which Americans tend to focus on, but that one's impact has been much more minute.
All right.
Certainly there, but refracted through like 5 other lenses, ranging from French Nietzscheism to, as I said, American neo-pragmatism. And the one thing that unifies critical theory is its emphasis as an epistemology, a way of knowing. Sorry for those unfamiliar with philosophical discourse, on exposing traditions or other philosophies, or in Adorno's words, ideologies of the violence that they inflict on others. Which means it treats the claims made in defense of them as insincere, in the sense that the people who make these claims don't sincerely believe they're true. And it avoids the arguments advanced in defense of these cases to conduct an exposure. all the time everywhere in modern society where people, it's like, I'm going to expose what's really going on, and then they pay attention to none of what the other person is saying and none of what his beliefs are, and they're like, actually he's just he's suffering from insecurity because his masculinity or his whatever is under attack. They've basically totally avoided the claim to erase the interpretation. And then when they have a discussion with that person, they're trying to drag them into their language game. Because they're just not acknowledging that there's any sincerity or intentionality or consideration behind what he's saying.
All right, so they're not affording him the respect of treating them as another.
Yeah. This is very much something you should be able to do as an adult, and it's an embarrassment that we even have to be talking about this on this channel. Not that adults should be perfect, but knowing that others have different perspectives and ways of, and that these can be wrong. They could be totally wrong. Let's just be clear here. Like, knowing that people can have different perspectives and ways of seeing and ways of using language from you, and being able to engage in what they are saying on their own terms is one of the things that should differentiate adults from children. Because children, they have a vague understanding that other people are real. They have no ability to cognize that.
All right.
But adults should. And so, funnily enough, like, ideology is what you call, like, reverse maturation. It's like, and so yeah, it's playing around with language functionally. So that would be in the sense in which you talk about using language structures, equivocating between meanings to draw the other person in.
So yeah, you are essentially, let me kind of distill this down. You're essentially putting someone else in a position where you no longer take them seriously and then attacking them through that lens.
Yeah. And you're structuring the way you use words to force them to play along. Basically. As I said.
So is this kind of the same thing where you get someone who's like really very religiously set on, say, like the world is 6,000 years old, and therefore anybody who believes there's evidence otherwise is like a servant of Satan.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when somebody says otherwise, they just accuse you of being a servant of Satan. Yeah. Impious. As I said at the start of the stream, we use ideology and fundamentalism as different words, and we associate these things with positions, which is, sometimes it is true. But oftentimes it is, like, you can be a creationist and accept that other people have other people have salient arguments and considerations for not being a creationist.
Yeah.
Plenty of creationists historically have been. Like, this is not a theoretical claim about the capacities of creationists here.
This is looking at like specific people seen do exactly this thing without discussing what their the soundness of their overall conclusions.
Yeah.
I've been in conversations where I've gotten accused of things and then kind of sidelined because of this.
Well, yeah. You've seen how many people have accused me of black magic for reading Lutheran meditation guides.
Yeah.
From the Reformation era. That horrible
sorceries right there.
Yeah, horrible black magicians like Johannes Kelpius and Kepler.
Yes.
The dark Lord Newton. and the worst of them all, Leibniz. Yeah, like people they'll make and then when you confront them, that this particular gentleman, when I was like, this is just a Christian philosopher talking about like meditation, he said, I know where you're going when you die, and like dipped from the convo. And it's like, okay, okie dokie, eggs and smoky. But yeah, that would be an excellent. That's the more obviously extreme. Well, actually, it's not the more. It's the more obviously extreme to us because it doesn't fit our worldview.
All right.
There's actually a lot of equally common things you see nowadays that are in many respects just as bad, if not worse. But they're not. They don't tick off like when. If you're not, I don't live in the deep south.
Right.
Surrounded by Bible thumpers. But so I meet outside of online discussions, I meet very, very few Bible thumpers who go on and on about like black magic and stuff and Satan.
Yeah, you live in Canada and I live in Texas.
That's nice biographical. But in Canada, so I live in a place where nobody has any cultural grounding, and so people who say things like that look totally ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Not because it's not funny, not even because they're wrong. It's just because they're coming out of nowhere with Satan. To somebody who just doesn't even believe in God. Like, why would this person believe in Satan? Or if he doesn't believe in God or any spirits? Is like, because Canadians are very, 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 very secular.
Yeah.
Very, laying aside some exceptional areas, Canadians in the main are not approaching the world from a religious lens, and religious claims, actually, like they look, and this would be an example of sort of intuitive, I guess, boorishness. It hasn't metastasized into a full-on ideology. It has for some, but then they'll be presented with religious claims, and sometimes they're not ridiculous or far-fetched religious claims, such as about, say, I don't know, the relationship between pain and contemplation. That's a subject you can't even publish on in the West because you're encouraging harm to people. And I am not endorsing it on this channel for that very reason.
Yes.
But yeah, like a hardline ascetic activity, any claims involving Satan, claims involving visitations from God, getting knowledge out of your dreams, picking up doing divination. Like, Canadians are going to look at or treat all of those as equally bizarre.
Yeah.
Those are not, like, nobody in Canada, they're not brought up in the news, they're not brought up online, or sorry, they're not brought up in like the public sphere. People would treat you as if you were ridiculous if you proposed that having that divination or dream visitations should have any impact on what goes on publicly. And again, it's usually, if people have a considered judgment on dream divination, that's fine. But it's usually knee-jerk. And then maybe if you push them, they defend it by connecting it to superstition or credulity coupled with hallucinations, which is going to be the atheist version of an ideology here.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's this. Now, that being said, this isn't quite what we've been talking about so far, because in that case they're not structuring your language, right? They're just telling you they think you're a cretin.
Yeah.
Because you think that fairies can talk to you in your dreams and give you useful info on how to garden. Whereas
report there, yeah.
No comment. No comment. No, whereas usually it tends to be with language. As a journalist are the worst for this. But you do see it. You see it a lot with people who structure. Because there's two sides here. There's the behavior they impinge on you when they get you to decode and respond to them, and then there's the assumptions they make about you themselves. And the paper, in order to be an absolute fervent ideologue, the paper I always recommend people read is Marilyn Frye's Oppression. That paper is just, if you ever want to know how to do and how to be a fervent like ideologue, ideologist, and committed to a really like a basically conspiracy theory in the worst sense of that word, not in the sense that like big pharma's bad, but totally unfalsifiable crypto babble, like read Marilyn Frye's Oppression and follow the advice.
Okay, well, give me give us a taste.
So Frye's Oppression is the thesis that if you want to determine that there's a conspiracy out to get you, well, Jews, whites, blacks, international Armenians. Trying to think of somebody who hasn't been in the news for international conspiracies lately, and Peruvians.
Yes.
The international Big Peru is out to get you.
All right.
You can pick man or woman too. But yeah, international Big Peru. And it's like, obviously, if I'm wandering out into the world to study this, I'm going to find a paucity of facts pointing to Peruvians controlling my every move. It's like there's just no Peruvians around. They don't own any of Canada. They're just not here. All the Peruvians are controlling me. I am living a blissfully Peruvian-free existence. Not too blissful because Peruvian food is nice. And Peruvians are pleasant people. But that aside, real life. So you interpret reality. You have a whole bunch of disparate facts, which is just true about reality in general. Usually, however, we look for patterns in those facts. And this is how we derive, say, theories. At least that's how it works in the sciences. And then you would go test those theories by seeing if the pattern holds. In this case, you have your interpretation, which exists. There's a word in philosophy, it's a priori. That means prior to experience. Everyone has some a priori beliefs, like space is real. Time is real. Like most of us are not sitting here absolutely convinced that there's no such thing as physical space, right? Because we're moving. You like pick up your hand, wave it. But that's an a priori belief because you can't actually conclude that physical space is real from waving your hands. It does, however, become a problem when you start picking up really weird a priori beliefs, such as there's an international league of Peruvians out to get me, and you then reconstitute the world around you as threads. So I used threads like patterns. You instead of weaving a pattern, you say you weave a cage. Her famous metaphor is the bird cage.
All right.
And it's like at first, nobody who's looking at it empirically will ever be able to prove that Big Peru controls your every action. But once you realize that Big Peru controls your every action, then you can see the bird cage constraining you. This now becomes an ideological interpretation where, on the one hand, everyone you see who's saying otherwise, whether they're a Peruvian person going, "What the heck, man? I've never done anything wrong to you in my life. I'm just over here, I don't know, painting houses for a living," or somebody who's just totally not Peruvian and maybe has done you a wrong. Like, let's say you get a ticket from the police for speeding. And you're accusing of being in league with Big Peru. And the police is like, "What are you talking about? My name is Vasily. I'm from Romania." It's like, he has no idea what you're going on about either. But you see these figures as like part of the birdcage. They're trying to constrain you in. Frye uses the birdcage. Adorno calls it the culture industry. The one I've seen flying around the internet is stuff like cathedral. It's all the same theory. which is really funny when you actually look at some of these. Like Adorno's The Culture Industry, for all its an ostensibly Marxist work, looks like it was written by some of the people going on about like the cathedral on certain message boards. It's really funny, really. But yeah, it's an interpretation. It blocks what the other person is trying to say, which is in this case the police officer informing you that he's not ticketing you because he wants to oppress you on behalf of Big Peru. He's ticketing you because you were going 150 in a 120 zone.
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually think there are any 120 zones, but let's pretend for a moment, because I said 150, and if you're going 150 in a 100 zone, you're going to jail. You're not getting a ticket.
We're just redefining
redefining the speed limit to make my metaphor work. No, if he catches you doing 80 in a 60 zone, right?
Mhm.
And he tickets, he's like, there. Big Peru is not the reason you got the ticket. The reason you got the ticket is because the community has decided that it is unsafe to move at 80 kilometers an hour on that particular area, and therefore it has a 60 speed limit, and you were moving faster than that, so the police ticketed you. That would be the sound, and that's of course another interpretation. That's just an interpretation that actually fits the facts instead of lying on top of them and smothering them and hiding them away.
Yeah.
And I guess to draw this all back together, because we've been talking a lot about language, like this, the problem with this is it just makes communication impossible. Right. The other person cannot talk to you. They can talk at you, which means they can just say things to you, but you're either like interpreting them out of existence, or ignoring them, or even mocking the person. And then on the flip side, like, yes, you're talking to them, and maybe they understand you. But they disagree, but there's no communication, like the Latin word, it involves with. That's what com is a Latin prefix that means like with, together, which is why you see like commixture, community, commingling, coed, together. Right? When two disparate things, there is no communication. There's merely communication. No, there's just talking at. So he's trying to say, well, actually, I don't think Peruvians control the planet, and I'm picking Peruvians. You can pick your real life global conspiracy of choice. You know, what is it? Whites, Jews, men, women, Armenians. That one is real. For that last one, I have encountered that one. But yeah, he's trying to communicate that he's not part of Big Peru. You're interpreting him as a Peruvocentrist, Peruvo supremacist. What would you even call this theoretical ideology I've clobbered out of thin air? Peruvism.
Peruvo-normativity?
Peruvo-normativity. Yeah, you're accusing him of Peruvo-normativity. And maybe, let's say there's thousands of you. There are thousands of you everywhere, and so the police officer, he knows that there's people who believe in Peruvo-normativity, and he understands what you're trying to communicate. Like, he knows what the word Peruvo-normativity means. He knows the deeper theory. He knows the arguments for it. He just thinks it's full of baloney.
All right.
Like, he because he's Romanian. Like, he's not, and none of what he's done has anything to do with Peru. He's not aware of Peru. Like, maybe he's never met a Peruvian in his life, and maybe he's so ignorant of Peru he doesn't even know they like speak Spanish there.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of, like, what do you ever see though? It's like all those old memes where it's like, where's Norway? It's like, oh yeah, it's part of Africa. He thinks Peru is an African country, and they speak French there. Like, that's how little this man knows but he knows the theory. He knows the theory. He just thinks it's wrong. And he's trying to tell that to you, but you can't internalize it. And you, on the other hand, are trying to spin him into your Peruvo-normative worldview. Either to convert him to the cause of anti-Peruvianism, or to justify it as much as to yourself as to other people, your neglect of him as an individual. But communication has ceased because there's just no conversation. There's no conversation happening because you can't, like, and again, like, all together. Almost every word I know in the English language for, like, talking amongst each other involves a Latin prefix for together. Like, language just doesn't exist. And so, yeah, funnily enough, I mentioned at the start of the stream that I really hate George Orwell.
All right. Finally.
Yeah, let's...
George Orwell bashing time.
Yeah, George Orwell bashing time. I know this because usually when you see discussions of this brought up, it gets tied into newspeak. So Orwell, before I think it was before he wrote 1984. It might have been after. That would surprise me. I suspect it was before. He wrote a very famous paper talking about, which I had to read in school, and its name is suddenly escaping me, but I had to read it. Oh man. He's talking about the way that corporate executives and government figures talk about death tolls. And he's pointing out that the use of these words is designed to profoundly hide the emotional, psychological, the normative impact of murdering tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands.
Yeah. Is it how the poor die?
How to what?
Is it how the poor die?
It may have been how the poor die. May have been how the...
it's a George Orwell essay.
No, it's not how the poor die. It's a it's a very short essay just going over... If you've read 1984, you know just elaborating the thesis from 1984 there. Or the thesis from his book there.
All right.
Sorry. Back on target. His theory, of course, and he critiques... It's actually a very crude variant of critical theory, which, to be fair, is sometimes accurate because he's conflating the language used with the tense. Passive voice is... So there's active voice and there's passive voice.
Yep.
Passive voice is what we use to deny agency to someone. So if I said, John broke the plates, that's active. Active voice is the plates were or passive, is the plates were broken. This is free corporate. Here's some free how not to fight with people time. People get much less upset when you tell them they did something horribly wrong in the passive voice.
Yeah.
Which is why it exists in English. Because it's like if I want to get John to stop breaking plates, I can say, John, stop breaking plates, you big dingus, but then I'll get upset. So you use the passive voice to say, well, it would be nice if, plates were less broken. And this is one of the easiest ways to deliver a rebuke and get the other person to listen to your rebuke. Without getting...
I've noticed that plates have been broken around here, and, I think things would be smoother if there was less.
if a little more care was used when washing plates, yeah.
Yeah.
On the flip side, because it denies agency, it's an easy way to deny responsibility.
Yeah.
So you see this all the time when, like, drugs or treatments that companies knew weren't effective get marketed to the general public.
Isn't it actually, to use a classic example, isn't that what happened with the golden cow?
Oh, Aaron?
Yeah.
Uh,
It's
there's a
like, yeah,
distinct
we
Jewish
threw the
interpretation of that passage, but yes.
yeah we threw them in there, and you know what? The cow came out. But
Yeah, that would be a good example. Yes, there is a Jewish interpretation that makes Aaron look like less of a dingus,
yeah, yeah.
but I will accept the plain reading for the moment. Um, yeah, that's an example. You see this all the time with pharmaceutical companies. They will release a painkiller or a like a lot of drugs involving mental health they knew would not do anything at the time, and then it didn't do anything and it harmed a whole lot of people for no reason. And when it's reported on, you will notice there's an amazing tendency to report on it in the passive. It's like, Purdue Pharma was the one behind the opioid epidemic, right?
Mm.
And they will say, instead of saying, Purdue Pharma, and to be fair to reporters, this is partially legal, right? You can't say Purdue Pharma killed 600,000 dead in America alone from opioid overdose. You say since Purdue began distributing, over 600,000 have died of opioid-related causes in the United States of America. That is rephrasing it. It takes agency away from Purdue. There is a legal, in that case, I can't blame the news too much, because if Purdue actually gets, the only way they could say Purdue killed 600,000 would be if they were all arrested. And right now they are fighting tooth and nail in the courts to keep they're fighting for there to be no investigation.
Yeah.
Never mind to keep from being arrested. But same with like the Volkswagen emissions scandal. So Orwell correctly critiques the tendency of people to sometimes use the passive voice to evade responsibility. And then he conflates it with bureaucratic or technical jargon.
Mm-hmm.
And I bring this up because my issue with Orwell is not that both of these things aren't actual problems. My issue is preferred alternative is transparent speech.
Mm.
And so Orwell, the reason why Orwell has never really been followed by anyone intellectually is that the transparent speech does not exist. Like there is no speech that just has pure meanings. He was the one who came up with window pane prose.
All right.
Right. Versus you were telling me about that, eh? Before our Bob the Builder stream.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, window pane versus stained glass. There is no such thing as window pane prose. There's very clear prose, maybe, but prose is always going to structure the way you perceive the claim.
Yeah.
Now, if you're sensitive to the way people use language, it's very easy to see past this.
Mm-hmm.
This is not, it's a skill a lot of people don't develop, but it's a really easy skill to develop. Just to cultivate that, being aware of how people use language. It takes a few months, and then you can get a hang on it pretty easy. And it's invaluable, even if it makes you look preternaturally cynical in today's day and age. But yeah, language, it always involves an act of interpretation, an act of connotation, evocation, so on and so forth, depending on what you're using and when. And this is why when critical theory gets picked up by the French Nietzscheans, / the post-structuralists, often, like Americans tend to, I know they just tend to use postmodernism to refer to 5 or 6 different movements. All of which have shared goals regarding relativism, but they're very distinct movements. And it's just, you want to be a little clear so you can destroy them better. But yeah, like when Derrida explicitly refers to, I don't think I can't remember if he calls out Orwell by name, but by implication he's insulting Orwell when he says that there is no language and no perception that is separate from interpretation. And he's perfectly correct. He's incorrect when he concludes that therefore everything is equally relative because it collapses in on an infinite multiplicity of meaning, which is a load of rot. But he is correct that everything involves interpretation. And so Orwell... Why is it that the people Orwell explicitly affiliated himself with in his lifetime, which is the group of people who want to celebrate being a socialist but don't want to be associated with any of the negatives of socialism, why did they end up being the most aggressive promoters of newspeak? And the answer is because... Well, the answer is, like, they were correct that Orwell was wrong. And so they designed words to describe or circumscribe possible realities in line with critical theory.
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes see Orwell, like, a lot of his modern day proponents refer to these words as nonsense in a semantic sense. That's not true. Wrong, yeah, like, they're wrong. They don't really refer to anything, and often they involve horrible implicit claims, but, like, the phrase cis-heteronormative patriarchy has a definite meaning. It has a very definite meaning. Grotesquely absurd one, but it has a meaning. Just today I saw a major one of these major accounts, all the rah free speech accounts, tweet out or post a video of Therians, right, Hound? Yeah. It's this person, and they're like, and they're it's like, my name is so and so. I use they, z, bone pronouns. I am a Therian. And a system user, I have DID. And then they go on a little more. And then it actually had a funny punchline. It got me to laugh. He's like, because they talk about how they're a bearded vulture or whatever. And it's like, I thought I was Jewish. No. But all the comments were that the person is just being mentally ill or whatever. And it's like, no. And I'm sitting there cursing myself because tragically I'm just too smart. I'm too in the know. No, because I actually know what they're talking about. I know what it means to be a Therian, and it's system using is a what would you even call that? You know what that is, a system?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of
is it like because you brought up the DID thing next to it, which that's kind of iffy, but it's like you're kind of like in some sort of plural system in your head.
Yeah, plural system. Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's people, they claim to have multiple personalities that they switch between at will. But I'm trying to think of a polite way. It's associated with people who like to play act having severe mental illness rather than people who actually have severe mental illness, who would not use that type of terminology because they wouldn't be that self-aware.
Yeah.
Speaking from experience, which is why I'm sitting there groaning because I know this person is not mentally ill, and that's the tragedy. But it's a totally meaningful sentence. Totally just potentially absurd, and in this case, immensely disrespectful to people out there who actually.
Yeah, if you claim you have DID, that's kind of like, all right, that's like I would think that if you say like they're a plural or something, then they're not kind of horning in on like mental illness hours.
Yeah. not in a salient sense, and it's it's
So you could,
nonsensical in the sense that they're wrong, and it's like arguably very offensive, um, and disrespectful to the people out there who are actually struggling with the types of severe mental illnesses that do sincerely impact your self of sense identity. Um, but it's not mental illness. But in order to do that, you have to engage in that. Like, funnily enough, Orwell's transparency ends up becoming an ideology
all right.
because it holds up this non-existent see-through language. It's just an ideology. You can't be. I mean, I guess you can't be self-reflective about any ideology.
Yeah.
But it's like one person is engaging in ideology because they're trying to fit everyone into Peruvo normativity, and the other is engaging in ideology by denying that Peruvo normativity is even a meaningful word.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, as I said, like that to me is why at core.
Yeah, I think also if you call someone, so in this situation, if you call someone mentally ill without engaging with them and seeing kind of a respectful dialogue on like what the heck do you mean by this, then yeah, you're kind of pigeonholing them.
Yeah, that's an old canard that should really die. Is the use of mental illness to dispose of intellectual worldviews you don't like. That was so. I guess the history of psychology is complex. I actually think it goes back 2,400 years because it's referred, like, there are diagnoses of melancholia and anxiety and what we would now call high-level autism in ancient Greece. Their cures for autism are fun and exciting and totally not awful. Nothing quite as medically effective as a stick. Medieval ages, but that being said, in the ancient world and in the medieval ages, mental health problems are not seen as distinct from physical health problems. They were seen as like imbalances of fluids or the result of bad air, or there's a whole bunch of different features, certain mental traits. Very famously, for instance, Marsilio Ficino, who led the Platonic revival, genius philosopher in the 15th century, held that scholars were disproportionately inclined to suffer from severe depression because they were more under the influence of the planet Saturn. Because Saturn is the planet of wisdom and death in astrology. And he recommended treating depression with going on long walks, having a party, and playing a violin. But psychology as we know it nowadays is the notion of the investigation of distinct mental illnesses. And obviously this is a grotesquely oversimplified history of mental health that would collapse on in-depth investigation, but just bear with. Like, it really starts to pick up in the 18th, 19th century. And one of the reasons it blooms so much is it gets connected to Enlightenment thinkers from the deist or atheist camps, or even some of the Protestant ones, who want to label religious experiences and religious exercises and even religion itself the result of mental illness. There's some really tragic history books written about just how many people were imprisoned, tortured, electrocuted for the sin of seeing fairies or a ghost or the Virgin Mary. It continued right into like the 90s when it was criminalized. But there are still individuals out there who want to use psychology as a weapon to basically, as they said, like, deny people however stupid their philosophy might be, right? Deny people what they're saying is a sincerely held view, and instead reinterpret it as the result of insanity. Incidentally, this holds true even for the actual severely mentally ill. Like I'm not going to. I said earlier I'm not going to take them into account when trying to determine like supernatural experiences, but they absolutely are capable of like basic reasoning. And just ignoring everything they have to say is absurd. Just as absurd as trusting them unequivocally. Like even plenty of schizophrenics have written fascinating works on philosophy or the arts, or even built enduring architectural structures. So this isn't even acceptable when it comes to people with actual schizophrenia. Like diagnosed, not self-diagnosed. So yeah, that would be. I don't. Would you even that? I guess that toes the line between like intuitive boorishness and ideology, because it is the result of ideological thinking, but it's so internalized that people are no longer even aware that this was ever a possible interpretation. Like I always see people saying like, we used to put people in asylums for this, right? And it's like, well, we did, but that was also a hugely controversial practice at the time, and we don't do it anymore for good reason. But there were plenty. Like this was one of the reasons the Quakers spread so quickly. Was the Quakers were monumentally opposed to the practice of forced confinement in institutions, asylums, and so they would create alternative mental health centers where people could be treated without like they were still, I guess, removed from the community, but they weren't basically imprisoned. And they would be given like taught they would be they would be taught how to paint, and they'd be given all sorts of life skills, and like eventually the hope was they'd be reintegrated with the community. And there have been people who have tried to bring that back. The Soteria project is going to be the most successful. That one it's in Israel. It's in the United States. It was started by a guy called Loren Mosher. I think that's his name. Yeah, Loren Mosher. American schizophrenia expert who instituted the Soteria project because he thought that pharmaceutical drugs should be a last resort. Not that he always rejected them. He just thought we were too dependent. And yeah, it was based on listening to what they had to say. The Hearing Voices project, who's Marius Rom, is that another one. But yeah, that's, I guess, how long are we? Oh yeah, we've been going an hour and a half now. Jeez. But yeah, like ideological, it destroys communication because it structures reality to avoid genuine understanding. And this is just as bad to the person who believes it as to the person they're speaking to. Because you're not like maybe the other person is trying to give you sincerely useful, true information, such as don't drive 80 through a 60 zone, which I know maybe doesn't, like in isolation, doesn't sound like the most profound info, but a lot of people just have this mental blockage in their mind that like pedestrians cross the road, and if you're going, the faster you go, the harder it is to brake. This is just common sense. Like if in order to brake quickly when you're going at 80 or 100, you have to basically like slam your foot and risk going into a tailspin.
Yeah.
This is why you cannot go 80 in areas near school children who run into the middle of the street.
Yeah.
It's not because you can't stop in time. And so this theoretical Romanian policeman who's arguing either about Peruvo-normativity, is giving you genuinely useful info here.
Yeah.
Like I've been to avoid the notion, like a lot of people knee-jerk react against this because they think you're defending all sorts of bizarre or horrific philosophies. And I was like, yeah, a lot of these things are just false, right? But like, as not to say the police are amazing human beings, but when they stop you from going 80 through a 50 zone, it's for a reason. And I am perfectly, maybe there's other ways to enforce that, but I am perfectly content to continue having speed limits.
Yep.
As relative as they may be. But like they structure reality to destroy communication and preclude real understanding, and especially when it's matters of communication. And then, of course, if the ideology becomes too predictable, they can just destroy communication because nobody wants to talk to you because they can replace you with a sock puppet.
Yep.
That's oftentimes that's more of a meme than it is a reality, but especially with the intersectional types, I hate having conversations with them because it's the same thing, and I can recite their points to me for them, usually better than they can recite them at me. And it's like, I could replace you with a sock puppet. And obviously, once that happens, it's like there's just no communication because you're not listening to them.
Yep.
But yeah. Which is, I guess, I know I mentioned Fahrenheit 451 at the start. It didn't bring it in where I wanted to. I will cap this off by stating that people always focus on the book burning in Bradbury, and they neglect the profound psychological insight into the nature of modern, like, entertainment worship.
All right.
Which is Bradbury notes, it's, I want to say page 77 of the 60th anniversary. I meant to read it, but I forgot the book upstairs, so we're just going off the top of my head. Is Montague is talking, the fireman, main character, is talking to Faber, and he's trying to convince Faber to join him in a printing press. And Faber is arguing with him, this is page 77 through 79, that it would be pointless. And he's like, you're missing the value. The magic of books is not in the book itself. The magic of books is what the book contains, which is it contains access to other worlds and other ways of thinking. And it can, in his word, books are, in Bradbury's words, books are porous. They have texture, and that texture is what gives them depth. Right. And he contrasts this with the television. Could have been a way of getting depth, but instead is merely a way of transparency and of producing laughs or entertainment or whatever.
Yeah.
And his example, Bradbury uses the Bible, or sorry, what we would call the Gospels, specifically the life of Jesus. And he starts talking about how Jesus has become a figure. He's become part of the family, like the cast of TV characters that people listen to. And sometimes he'll sell you products, and sometimes he'll give you political advice. But he's just a character. And nobody, like the message that Jesus tried to impart in the Gospels has just been destroyed by entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And Bradbury's point here then is, like, it wasn't that society banned books. It was that there was no books vanished, and society merely acted what was already seen as unacceptable, which was thinking, quality, and depth. And this is something I think a lot of free speech advocates don't understand. Do you know the refrain, you can burn books, but you can't burn the ideas they contain?
Yep.
Actually, the ideas are the easiest stuff to destroy All you need to do is make them unintelligible.
Mm-hmm.
Right. A lot of people out there fighting for books, like to preserve books whose meaning they don't understand and that they couldn't possibly engage with because they lack the ability to care about what the writer is talking about. So,
Yep.
yeah.
All right.
I guess that's a reasonably good place to end off. Unless you had any questions, anything you think I was unclear about.
No, I think we are. I think we're good. So to sum it up, from our definition of ideology, it's like the kind of the stagnation of like this mental net for through which we understand the world and through which we kind of allow it to take meaning, and you can easily use that to pigeonhole people into positions they would not otherwise be part of, and then push that upon them and not engage with them at all, which destroys any communication between you and them.
Yeah.
So you're not doing anything.
Yeah, you're not doing anything. You're not helping yourself, because by doing this, you preclude genuine depth, even internally.
Yeah.
Like, even just by understanding correctly how the individual is wrong. And you're not helping anyone either, because as I just noted, like freedom, like I think freedom isn't the absence of order. It's like it's when order manifests into possibility. But in this sense, freedom is intimately tied to caring.
Yeah.
The free man is not the apathetic or the egoistic or he's the guy who cares.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what lets him, that's what lets him think. But yeah, I'm going to, unless there's anything else, I will end here for the evening.
All right.
Alrighty. If you enjoyed this stream, please like, comment, subscribe, send it to all your relatives, kiss it goodnight. As always, there are novels of mine in the description, and I will see you all maybe definitely Thursday to talk about dragons. I might do a stream before then to talk about why everything isn't political, depending on how timing works.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening. Good night.